Whilst Israel commits all-out genocide of Palestinians in Gaza, it's also bombing Lebanon and bombing Syria. Let's take a look at all the oppressive regimes and genocides Israel has supported in its short 75-year existence. Israel was involved in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. The Rwandan genocide is recognized as one of the worst genocides in modern history. Over 1 million Tutsis were murdered by Hutu militias. Israel armed those Hutu militias. Israel supplied the guns, the rifles, bullets and grenades used to murder over 1 million Tutsis in Rwanda. And since 1994, Israel has tried to conceal all of its arms exports to Rwanda, fearing prosecution. It is also no surprise that whilst Israel practices its own apartheid, it was apartheid South Africa's staunchest ally. Israel didn't only arm the apartheid government, it was also helping them to create nuclear weapons. Whilst other governments around the world were boycotting apartheid South Africa, placing an embargo on that government, Israel was the only one to oppose that boycott and that embargo. And for decades, the Zionist Israeli Federation in South Africa have honoured men such as Percy Utah. Percy Utah prosecuted Nelson Mandela and led to Nelson Mandela spending 27 years of his life in prison for fighting apartheid. Throughout Guatemala's civil war from 1960 to 1996, over 200,000 indigenous Mayans were murdered by state forces, and over 1 million were displaced. The Guatemalan state forces responsible for the Mayan genocide were, of course, armed and trained by Israel. Even when the US suspended all of its military funding to the Guatemalan state forces carrying out this genocide, Israel filled in the gap. Not only did Israel give them $38 billion worth of arms to continue this genocide, the Galil assault rifle, an Israeli-made weapon, became standard issue for the Guatemalan state forces carrying out this genocide. Israel also provided licenses for Guatemalan forces to make their own weapons in Guatemala. Since 1990, hundreds of American police officers, including agents from the FBI, the CIA, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, have been sent to Israel on police exchange training programs. The knee-to-neck restraint used by Derek Chauvin to murder George Floyd is also used by Israeli police and Israeli soldiers against Palestinians. Black Lives Matter. Israel was also involved in the Srebrenica genocide. In 1995, over 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were murdered by Serbian state forces. Serbian state forces that were armed and trained by Israel. Serbian state forces ethnically cleansed over 250,000 Bosnian Muslims from Croatia and Bosnia. Tens of thousands were wounded. Thousands were starved and mass raped. Many were held in concentration camps. Many of the leading figures within the Serbian state forces responsible for the genocide of Srebrenica actually fled to Israel. They fled to Israel and were granted Israeli citizenship in order to avoid arrest and prosecution for crimes against humanity. Israel was also involved in Pinochet's coup in Chile. The CIA-backed dictator Augusto Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende's democratically elected government. Just one day after overthrowing Salvador Allende's government, Pinochet began creating concentration camps, filling these concentration camps with anyone he believed to be left-wing. These concentration camps were run by Pinochet's secret police, DINA. Secret police also armed and trained by Israel. Pinochet's dictatorship over Chile lasted decades, and throughout those decades, Israel was constantly arming Pinochet's genocidal regime. Israel is involved in oppression all around Latin America. Whilst Israel was one of Pinochet's biggest supporters, it's also arming police repression in Chile today. It's one of the Chilean government's biggest arms exporters. The Israeli government and the Chilean government have signed military cooperation initiatives, which of course play a part in oppressing the indigenous Mapuche people in Chile and also the indigenous Palestinians in Palestine. During El Salvador's civil war from 1979 to 1992, Israel was arming the death squads that were murdering the activists resisting the dictatorship. From 1975 to 1979, for example, Israel was supplying El Salvadorian death squads with 83% of their arms. Israel supplied these death squads with helicopters, army trucks, guns, rifles, and ammunition. Several of the leading figures within the El Salvadorian death squads actually sent their children to Israel. They sent their children to Israel during the civil war so their children could be safe, whilst those death squads were going after all the left-wing activists in El Salvador. Israel was also involved in arming the Nicaraguan dictatorship, which was led by the Somoza family. Israel armed this corrupt dynasty dictatorship, again with arms, rifles, ammunitions, helicopters, army tanks, and other military equipment. Israel is also involved in arming Colombian police. In 2021, we saw popular protests all across Colombia condemning police brutality. Israel is the chief arms supplier to Colombian military and police and state forces. Israel is of course also involved in ethnically cleansing Armenians. Israel has been funding and arming Azerbaijan's military since 1988. Israeli arms used to murder Armenians. Over 70% of Azerbaijan's overall military arsenal is supplied by Israel. In addition to arming Azerbaijan, who are ethnically cleansing Armenians currently, Israel also refuses to recognize the Armenian genocide. The Armenian genocide, which took place from 1914 to 1923, where Turkish forces systematically murdered over 1.5 million Armenians. Israel is also, of course, involved in arming India in its occupation of Kashmir. India is Israel's largest arms client. Israel provides India with the arms used to militarily occupy Kashmir and brutalize Kashmiris. Since 1989, over 100,000 innocent Kashmiris have died at the hands of Indian state forces. And it is of course no coincidence that Israel's staunch ally would be the United States, another settler colony established on stolen land, established on Turtle Island. Another settler colony that is still oppressing First Nations peoples. Land back from Palestine's Turtle Island. A lot of Americans are outraged that Biden is supporting Netanyahu, especially since October 7th, where Israel has bombed hospitals, mosques, churches, killing thousands of innocent Palestinians. But of course, Biden would have no problem with that whilst he's still oppressing the indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. It is also no surprise that Justin Trudeau and Netanyahu are staunch allies, because of course Canada is also a settler colony just like Israel, still oppressing the indigenous peoples that land belongs to. It's of course no coincidence that Israel and Australia are allies, when of course Australia is also a settler colony built on indigenous Aboriginal land. Staunch allies have to have something in common. And what they have in common is that they're still oppressing the indigenous peoples of the lands they're occupying and colonizing. And whilst these settler colonies are staunch allies, so are the indigenous peoples they're colonizing. It's no coincidence that every single protest for Palestine will see our First Nations brothers and sisters protesting alongside us. Land back always was, always will be, and it's time for a decolonized Palestine. The Palestinian struggle is literally connected to all other struggles around the world. Israel doesn't just oppress Palestinians. It's involved in the oppression of millions of people around the world. And we think it's about time that oppression ends. From Palestine to Turtle Island, that we come out for all struggles, from Palestine to Stolen Sisters to Black Lives Matter. All of our struggles are one, all of our struggles are connected. Demand an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, a lifting of Israel's illegal blockade and siege on Gaza, an end to Israel's military occupation, for all indigenous lands to be decolonized from Turtle Island to Palestine. We want the right of return for over 7.4 million Palestinian refugees, and we want justice.